I'm so happy to be here with everybody today. I want to have a conversation with you today about some tectonic shifts that are happening in technology. And a lot of my perspective is shaped from my most recent experience, which was 4.5 years of leading DARPA. That was an unparalleled perch from which to see technology, but also be part of helping to drive it. And I just found it to be a tremendous privilege to get to serve in that role, working with some amazing people and doing that work for our country. I found that some of the most meaningful conversations that we had at DARPA were not about the technology per se, but actually about how our society would choose to use it when it fully blossomed. And I wrapped up at DARPA in January at the end of the Obama administration, and those kinds of questions are the focus of my work today. So what I want to do today is explore two areas where there's some very big technology shifts going on, one in the information revolution and one that is emerging with biological technologies. And we'll do a deep dive into a couple of different areas. We'll talk about some things that are real now, and then we'll get a little bit more speculative about some technologies that are farther out. But in addition to the technologies, I also want to talk about the human choices that are going to come with these technologies. I find that a lot of the discussion of technology is about what it's doing to us, but I think we all understand that actually we get to decide. It's our responsibility to decide. And so I also want to tease apart some of the very deeply human issues that go with these technologies. So let's start with the information revolution. That in itself is not new. It's been underway for a number of decades now. First came this phase of computing, then came the phase of networking and communications and connectivity. And all of those earlier eras in the information revolution have left us now with this flood of data. And so now we're in this third period in the information revolution that is about figuring out what to do with that data. It's the period of big data and artificial intelligence. And these are the tools that let us process and manage and compare those huge piles of bits and start seeing what's in them and then figuring out how to really get value, how to use that data. So, that's something that I think we're all very familiar with in our day-to-day lives. Every time you go, I'll go to Google, I'll put in something that seems really obscure, and before I can finish typing it, it auto-completes. Or when I talk to Siri or you talk to Alexa, when an app on your smartphone reroutes you in traffic, these are all everyday examples that we're living with of these kinds of powerful new capabilities, data analytics and artificial intelligence and machine learning. But in fact, these same technologies are starting to create some very interesting shifts in a whole host of other domains. And I'll give you a couple of examples out of DARPA's recent portfolio. Sometimes it's about using the tools of artificial intelligence to look at different kinds of patterns. Typically in these consumer applications, we think about seeing patterns in language or seeing patterns in images. DARPA set out last year to try to use artificial intelligence in a very different realm, which is in how we might manage the radio spectrum in the future. Of course, the way that we manage the radio spectrum today, it's worked pretty well for a long time. We basically carve out a slice and sell it to a cellular carrier, and we set aside another slice of the spectrum for the military, for radar and communications. But I think we all know that with the insatiable appetite that all of us have for wireless data, we're simply not going to have enough capacity in the spectrum. That's a limited resource. And so the question that DARPA is asking today is whether we can construct a very different way of sharing the spectrum dynamically on the fly. And to do this, the agency last year challenged teams to build radio networks with embedded artificial intelligence that could sense and form models and hypotheses about how other networks were using a shared slice of the spectrum, and then from that figure out when that network should jump in. And so by sampling and transmitting and adapting, we think it's going to be possible for radio networks to transmit many, many times as much wireless data just in a limited band of spectrum. So a very different example, but again, using the same kinds of tools and technologies. And here's a very different example. It turns out we're very, very good at understanding the parts and the pieces of complex systems, but it's still very challenging to figure out what all the interactions among those parts and pieces do. So think about, for example, individual trading algorithms. In financial markets, we're pretty good at understanding what each algorithm does, but we don't fully understand how they're interacting in ways that lead sometimes to a flash crash. So a couple of years ago, DARPA started a new program to try to build the capacity to construct whole system causal models out of thousands of bits of research. And that program started with one particularly hairy, tough challenge, and that was to untangle the crucial interactions that are happening among tens of thousands of metabolic processes within a cancer cell. So a very different example. And each of these stories is, in one way or another, it's about wrangling complexity. But of course, when we think about complex systems, the most complex systems we know are humans, how we behave as individuals and how we behave as societies. And in fact, I think potentially the most powerful applications of data analytics and artificial intelligence, this wave of technology, will prove to be in the social sciences. And let's do a deep dive in a particular project that I think starts bringing that to life. This one's not a DARPA project, but it's work that's been done at Harvard's Institute for Quantitative Social Sciences. The researchers were Gary King and Jennifer Pan and Margaret Roberts. Their laboratory was the realm of Chinese social media. And a few years ago, they were digging around and looking at social media posts. They went back to check on one of them, and they found that the post had disappeared. And they quickly realized that that meant that they were able to see what posts are getting censored. And so they set out to see if we could start proving some of the hypotheses and theories that people have had about when and how and why the Chinese government censors social media posts. So that's a great thing to try to get your arms around, but how do you do this? Here's a country of 1.3 billion people. Half of them are on social media. Unlike the United States, where there are a handful of dominant social media sites, in China it's over 1,000 different websites. There are reported to be hundreds of thousands of people who are censors for the central government, local governments, or for the social media sites themselves. And so it's a very large, messy environment. And when you try to understand what's going on by sampling anecdotes, it seems like any anecdote you come up with just supports the hunch that you have. How do you really see the bigger patterns that would give you a sense, a really meaningful understanding of the intent of the censorship? So what this team did was, it turns out that this idea that the data will simply tell you the answer, I think, is a little bit bogus. In fact, what they did was combine the classic methods of social science, the inquiry of social science, but they amped it up with big data tools to let them manage these kinds of volumes, and very carefully constructed, very carefully validated statistical methods. And here's how they went about it. They started by collecting billions of posts across a 6-month period. They drew these from over 1,300 social media sites, so this massive posts. And then they did some real social science. They came up with 85 different topics that were current in that period, in that 6-month period of time. They picked topics that were highly controversial, like topics, for example, like a Chinese dissident, or discussions of corruption policy, but they also picked non-controversial topics like the release of a popular video game. And then with their tools, they were able to take those billions of posts, extract a mere 3.7 million posts that tied to those 85 topics, and what that meant is then for each topic, they could see over a 6-month period the number of posts. So, just as you'd expect, more posts sometimes, fewer posts other times. And then, for each of the 3.7 million posts, they could go back and see which ones had been censored. And so, just as they could track over a 6-month period the posts, they could also track censorship. So now, some patterns start emerging out of this primordial soup of posts. And they started to see some interesting things. What they found, first of all, is that for almost all of the topics, the level of censorship was quite modest. And then, as you would expect, during a news surge, an event would happen, there would be news, and then there'd be this massive spike in posts. And different things seem to happen then. Sometimes the censorship level would remain low, but sometimes the censorship level would spike enormously and essentially shut down that whole discussion topic. So now they could start testing some hypotheses. The first one that they tested, is a perfectly logical one that you might imagine that people had had for a while, which was that the Chinese government was censoring criticism of the government. Makes sense, right? But actually, they couldn't find anything that supported that hypothesis. What they found were post after post that were highly critical. They found posts about Tiananmen. They found posts that called the one-child policy brutal. They found posts about local corruption, about local officials having mistresses, and none of those posts were being censored. So clearly something else was going on, and the team spent some time trying various hypotheses. What they finally discovered is that what the data shows is that Chinese censorship essentially shuts down a topic when there's a volume surge that is tied to the possibility of collective action. And you can see it in this chart. These are 4 of those 85 topics, and you can see that there's this low red. The red is the censorship level, the gray behind it is the number of posts, and again, you see that they're very bursty and spiky, and you can see that in most periods of time, the censorship level for each of these 4 topics is pretty low, and then those spikes, which are correlated with specific events and news, during those spikes, you frequently will just see the discussion get completely shut down by the censors. And I think this is sort of cool to look at because what you'll see is one of these is about riots, one's about protests, one is about the arrest of a dissident who had previously done a crowdsourcing project to collect the names of all the children who were killed in the terrible earthquakes a number of years ago. So those were clearly anti-government or concerning to the government. The one that says environmental lottery, though, was a notion that was being promoted by someone who had been lauded by the central government and doesn't seem to have any particular negative criticism of the government inherent in it. And yet, because of the nature of the discussion and the move towards collective action, it too had this very high level of censorship during that period of time. So contrast those graphs to these. These are 4 more topics, and again, pretty contentious topics, but in these cases, when news spikes happen, when volume surges happened, the censorship level remained pretty low, and it's because we now believe from this work that it was because there wasn't this link to the notion of collective action. So here's a really interesting new capability that we're starting to get some understanding of fairly complex, sophisticated behaviors on a vast scale. And it's not that the curtain's dropping and everything's now completely clear, but what is happening is that with these tools, the boundary between tractable and intractable problems is moving in a really meaningful way today. So these folks basically have a new scope to see in Chinese social media. They've gone on to use that to look at some other patterns. I mentioned that most topics had a low rate of censorship during most periods of time. It turns out that there are 2 topics where censorship seems always to be high. One, as you might expect, is pornography. And the other one is one particular kind of criticism of the government, and that is criticism of the censors, which I love, because how's that for human behavior? They also found that they seem to be seeing a surge in censorship just before the government takes a controversial action. So there may be a predictive nature in these data. And then their most recent work has been looking not at what the government takes down from social media sites, but the posts that it's putting up in the names of ordinary people. And what they're seeing there is a pattern of strategic distraction, essentially about 500 million posts a year that are being put up, it seems, to change the subject rather than engage on something that's controversial. So, pretty powerful new capabilities. All of this is about China and social media, and that's what's happening inside the Great Firewall. We all know about what's happening with information and information conflict in the wide open internet that we're living in, much wider open internet that we're living in. We know that ISIS is using this realm to recruit and to incite violence and terror. And now we have news reports over the last few years of Russia using propaganda to shift opinions. And the countries in which we've seen these reports are the Ukraine, we've seen it in the Netherlands, we've seen it in Austria, Bulgaria, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Hungary, Montenegro, and now the United States of America. Now, what's happening here? So information warfare is a very old business, this business of shifting opinions with this whole spectrum that starts with spin and moves to propaganda and fake news to outright lies. So that in itself is not new, but of course what's happening is that now it's intersecting with the evolution of social media. And we've all been living this. Social media started as this wonderful thing, which is still going on, by the way, which is about people connecting and building communities. And the communities that it has built are enormous. Facebook and other social media sites are used by 70% of adults in the United States today, and that cuts across demographic groups. It's a phenomenal shift. And when you see that kind of community built, that is an enormous message for anyone who has something to sell. And that means commercial marketing, but it also means propagandists. So very interesting things that are happening. All of these stages in the evolution of social media have been enabled by technology. But wait, there's more, because we're not done yet. And today we're at the threshold of the next phase in that evolution, because the tools are now becoming available so that companies or nation states or groups of any kind can carefully craft, shape a message that's sent out to very specific individuals. They can not only send that message, but now they can assess how those recipients react to that information, how they share it further, and then from that understanding, they can go back and tune their original message and tune their original networks. And all of that is being done, it's being iterated, rinse and repeat 24/7, because now you don't need armies of people to do that. More and more that's being done with machines and algorithms. And so the power of the tools for anyone who wants to broadcast into social media and also narrowcast and reach particular communities, whether you're a company with a product to sell, whether you're ISIS or Russia, or whether you want to counter one of those narratives, these tools are increasingly available. So that's what's going on. Now here we are in the United States, and we're in a period of time in which we're trying to figure out, what are we going to do? Who are we going to censor? What are we going to censor? And who's going to be doing the censoring in social media? These are very challenging questions in a country whose bedrock is the freedom of speech and the freedom of assembly. So I think we're at a very, very interesting juncture. And the technology is going to be there to let us do whatever we want. We can censor with a scalpel, or we can censor with an axe. We can craft narratives of all different types to project them out into the world, and anyone can do that. The technology also gives us one more thing that I think is a very powerful tool, and that is, back to this Harvard work as an example, a scope to see, a way to understand the forces at work and the way that information is being shaped. And that lets us shine a light in a way that I think might need to be an important part of how we respond today. So let me come back to China for a moment. When China chooses to censor social media that is related, that contains the threat of collective action, it's showing its values, it's revealing who it is. And in the choices that we're going to make today here in the United States about what we do in social media, we too will reveal who we are as a country. So that's just one very narrow, actually a very small piece of what's happening as new tools enable a different set of questions and new opportunities in social sciences, and that's only one of many, many fields that this wave of the information revolution is starting to change as we learn how to grapple with complexity in some very, very powerful new ways. So let me shift gears and talk about a very different topic now, and that is what's happening in biology. So biology has been a descriptive science for its entire history. For a few centuries, we mere mortals have been bit by bit understanding what evolution has wrought over a few million years. And it's been a long journey, but now something that is qualitatively different is starting to happen in biology as it intersects with information technology and with the physical sciences and engineering. And that is, we're now starting to be able to design and implement in biology. We're starting to have biological, technological capability. And this is happening in a number of ways. One is about gene editing and synthetic biology. And if you follow what's happening here, you know that today we can read the 3 billion base pairs in a human genome for about $1,000. And not only can we read DNA sequences, but we can build DNA and RNA sequences. That's a lot harder, so we don't build 3 billion of them, but we can build strands that are very, very useful. And now, with techniques like CRISPR-Cas9, we can go in and edit a specific gene out of a genome and edit in a different one. And the applications of these technologies are myriad. Researchers are using yeast to come up with engineered yeast to come up with whole new chemistries that haven't been possible before. Teams are working to engineer and design microbial communities that can eat oil spills in the ocean, or microbial communities that can stabilize your gut. So wherever you travel or whatever water you drink, you can maintain your gut health. We are starting now to be able to tackle the problems of fast-moving infectious disease by giving people fast protection against an emerging disease. We're doing that by designing DNA and RNA strands that use the individual's own body as a bioreactor to create the antigens or antibodies that you need for rapid protection. And people are even starting now to talk about how we might engineer mosquitoes to shut down malaria in different regions. And every one of these applications is going to come with its own set of very interesting and very tough questions. Is it ethical to engineer a species? If hundreds of thousands of humans are still dying every year from malaria, is it ethical not to engineer that species? So some very important and I think very healthy discussions are happening as these gene editing and synthetic biology technologies are coming out of the research lab. I want to focus in on a different area of biological technology, and that is where neuroscience is becoming neurotechnology. Now, historically, we understood how the brain functioned one stroke at a time. We would tie an impairment to the region that was injured. And now we've come so much farther than that. Today, we're entering an era of precision neurotechnology. And DARPA has been driving a lot of the research in the most recent chapters of neurotechnology. So I'd like to tell you a few stories about that. DARPA's work here began with a dream, and it was a dream that a veteran who had lost an arm serving our country could someday play the piano again or feel the joy of holding their kid's hand. And to try to accomplish this seemingly impossible task, we set out a number of years ago to understand motor control and sensory feedback, just those two pieces as a start. And DARPA's research teams working in this area have made enormous advances. What they're doing is using very fine electrodes, either on the motor cortex and the sensory cortex, or in some instances in the peripheral nervous system. And from those fine electrodes, they are able to pick up the electrical signaling from specific neurons. And then with very sophisticated signal processing, they're able to translate those electrical pulse trains into an understanding of the specific action that the brain had in mind. So when I think about moving my arm or hand, what are those electrical patterns? What's the brain trying to do? And then we're also now able to go the other direction, which is to craft the electrical signals, which when fed into the body, tell the brain about the experience of sensation. Both sides, pretty amazing. And it's been really beautiful to watch as some of the early volunteers, people who are paralyzed or who've lost limbs, have worked with our research teams. We've seen individuals be able to move a mechanical arm and hand using just their thoughts. We've seen people be able to fly a plane in a flight simulator. just by thinking about it. We've been able to see an individual feel the sensation of touch on a mechanical finger. Every one of those has been an aha moment, but something bigger happens when you start being able to combine motor control and sensory feedback. And so I want to show you one slice of work that we've been doing in this area, that DARPA's been doing. It's no longer we. And I'd like to start by introducing you to Doug. You can see that Doug lost his forearms. That happened in an electrical accident about 25 years ago. That hook that you see is the standard prosthetic that he has. And this particular work that's going on at the University of Utah is using the nerves in his peripheral nervous system. On the right-hand side, you see that yellow band on his residual limb. That band is covering up where the electrodes are that have been implanted. And those electrodes are doing these two things. One set of electrodes is picking up the signals that signal motor intent, and the other set of electrodes are feeding in the electrical patterns to give him the sense of touch. And what I want to show you is a little video, and in this video you see Doug is off to the right, that's his residual limb, and we're looking at the same screen that he's looking at. In this particular stage of the work, he's not controlling a mechanical arm, he's controlling a virtual hand that's in this virtual environment with a virtual door behind it. And what you're going to see is Doug will think about moving his arm and his hand. His residual limb will move, but the virtual hand will move as well. And then when it touches the door, he's going to get that sensation of touch. So let's experience this with Doug.
Oh my God, I just felt that door. Oh yeah.
Can you feel the finger sliding when you do that?
Yeah, actually I can. Bring it on there. God, that is so cool.
I think it's very cool every time I see that. So what we just saw was that for the first time in 25 years, Doug thought about moving a hand, he saw the hand move, and then he got the sensation of touch when it made contact with something. And when all those things happened together, it became as if that hand was his, and something very different happened, and a very powerful moment along in this journey. So restoring motor control and sensory function and the sense of embodiment, of feeling whole again, that's an enormous opportunity for neurotechnology, but it's actually only one of the things that's happening in research in neurotechnology today. Researchers are working to try to restore neuropsychiatric health by correcting the imbalances across regions, multiple regions of the brain. They are working to restore the ability to form and then recall memories after memory impairment. And they're working with the peripheral nervous system to monitor and to be able to directly control the organs of the body. So there are many different dimensions of what's happening in neurotechnology. And I want to be very clear, as you can see from the video, we're still at a very early research stage in laboratories. So this is not yet robust capability. But even at this stage, we can start to see that there are going to be some mind-bending questions about how we use these technologies in the future. Because the work starts with a focus on restoration, but at least in terms of the technology, there's not much distance from restoration to enhancement. And the possibility of neural enhancements now is becoming very real. So what do you think? Do you think in the future we're going to live in a society in which neural enhancements will be a privilege? Will they be a right? Might they be a mandate? Or I don't know, maybe the whole idea is just going to creep us out so much we just decide we want nothing to do with it. But imagine if you could learn a new language as fast as a 6-year-old. Or imagine if you could experience a whole new palette of colors or a fourth physical dimension in space. Imagine if we could connect among ourselves in new and deeper ways, and imagine if those connections happened in a way that gave us so much empathy and understanding of each other that we could put our minds together, literally, to take on some of the world's hardest problems. If we could get to that future, In that future, we would look back at today's reality and it would feel like black and white. It would feel like flatland. So it's possible that that future might be a reason to wrangle with all these tough questions that neurotechnology is going to bring us. So lots of questions, no dearth of questions. We've been talking today about two big shifts in the information revolution with biological technologies. These are two out of many things that are happening in the broad sweep of technology. And we can start to see the kinds of futures that are coming at us, but obviously they're going to come in very different ways because these technologies each have their own pathway, their own technology future that they need to pursue. Markets will behave in different ways. So I think that they're quite varied, but with all their differences, here's what these technologies have in common. In every case, we're going to be attracted by the possibility of solving problems that have never been possible to tackle before. We're going to pursue this hope of enhancing the talents and the capabilities that we're born with. We're going to pursue this hope of enhancing and improving the human condition. That's what this is really reaching for. And at the same time, we're going to be repelled by the disruptions that these technologies bring, the disruptions to work and wages, the disruptions to the equality that we seek in our society, and even to what we think it means to be human. Because in their various ways, each of these research efforts points to a future where we'll work with our technologies, not just side by side, but we'll come together with our technology with such a degree of intimacy that sometimes the boundary between us and them is going to blur. It's going to seem to disappear. But please, let's not lose sight of this vital fact. The important decisions about our future are deeply human choices. And so they belong not to our machines, but to us. Thank you. Thanks very much for coming. I'd love to hear your questions and comments. I know there's some mics coming down. Let's start with the gentleman right here in the front.
Thanks for coming. You mentioned two projects. Can you fill out the rest of the palette that DARPA's looking at?
I think I mentioned quite a handful in what I just talked about. At any moment in time, DARPA typically has about 200 or 250 active programs, and they range, as you would expect for an agency of the Defense Department with the Charter of Breakthrough Technologies for National Security. Some of them are about complex new military systems, new capabilities that will go directly to the military, and others are about the enabling technologies that are vital to military capability, but then end up affecting all the rest of us as well. And many of the examples I gave you today, from the radio spectrum to understanding whole systems causal models, to the work in biological technologies, those are great examples of things that are crucial to national security, but I think are going to have a bigger footprint for us as well. Let's come up here.
Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed your lecture, and it raises so many questions for me. It has seemed to me over the last 30 or 40 years that collaboration would be important between all of these labs and scientists, et cetera, that are working on a specific problem, like cancer, for example. And what I've come away from is this maybe rush to publish, rush to win the grand prizes. And it seems to me that all the technologies you're talking about are so complex. And I'm wondering what the state of the art is today in terms of this collaboration. And is that really exists as a subtext between everything you're doing? I mean, again, the complexity seems outrageous.
Yeah, and I think, I would characterize the way the research enterprise works. First of all, like anything else, it's driven by incentives. And so, what inspires a researcher? They really are trying to get to the root of the issue that they're tackling, whether it's, cancer, artificial intelligence, whatever it is. But they're living in a soup in which they have to find funding for it. they're going to get rewarded by tenure and or publications and or promotions in a company. So all of those things shape their work. I will tell you, I think that the research enterprise, many stresses and issues, but fundamentally I think very, very robust, very, very healthy. And again, I think we are extremely good at figuring out the bits and pieces, but where I think we haven't really been able to tackle understanding entire systems with very complex nonlinear interactions. And I don't think it's felt that fruitful until now, but these new tools and the methodologies that are coming are allowing people, I think, to go beyond that individual narrow focus in one lab. And to your question, I think because the possibilities are so huge, I think it's starting to shape behavior. People are finding that they want to work in different ways because of the outcomes and the achievements that can be made that way. So I think, among other things, what's happening is a rewriting of how research gets done, and that's one of the most, I think, ultimately will be a very productive new direction. Down here.
Thank you so much for being here today. Isaac Asimov thought of his three laws before he could even really conceptualize the idea of robotics, but he took some kind of accountability for the ethics behind what he was doing. Yeah. And you're talking about, we have all these questions that come out of all of this technology. As we race forward in technology, it raises ethical questions. Is there a need to create some kind of guiding principles as we move forward in this biology and all these other things that you're presenting and things that we're hearing here over the last few days? And if we are to create these principles to guide us, is it the role of DARPA to do these kind of things as the person on the front end of this? Or is it more natural for almost third bodies to be the counterpoint to the science?
I'll say a word about how we thought about these issues at DARPA. First of all, we found that over and over, because of our mission, we were seeing these amazingly challenging questions out beyond the laboratory stage that we were in. So we often were stumbling into these questions, we felt, before others were seeing them. And we felt that we had two responsibilities. One was to pursue this research, because our job is to prevent technological surprise and make sure that when there are surprises coming out of research, the United States and our national security capabilities, we're driving it, right? And we're not on the receiving end. So that was core to our mission, but we also felt that part of our responsibility was to shine a light on those ethical quandaries that were coming. It's not, figuring out how to do the research ethically, there are rules and guidelines, and that's very manageable. The real question is, when these become real technologies that our society is going to use, how are we going to grapple with them? And you want to ask those questions when you're still in research, right? So we put quite some effort in areas like neurotechnology, in big data and privacy, in synthetic biology, in putting together expert panels, making sure that we were communicating clearly about how we were doing our work and how we were thinking about it. So I don't think DARPA should be, I don't want to live in a society where a bunch of technologists and national security tell you how to behave ethically, but I do think it was incumbent on us to be thinking about it in our own work. And I think this comes maybe to your core question. One thing that has really struck me, having grown up in the engineering world and having been educated in that realm, is I think it's changing a little bit now, but ethics really wasn't, we didn't take a class in ethics when we were engineering students. That's starting to change. I think initially the focus is how do you build things that are safe. That's a very good place to start. But these deeper questions, I think, would be valuable to introduce to kids as they're going through the curriculum. I found it to be such a contrast with the military service members that we worked with. Military officers have ethics training as so core to what they do that they can't imagine that everyone else isn't talking about that. And it's so important for the things that they do on our behalf are force them to have to confront ethics in a very serious way. And I was always struck that they had been thinking very seriously about those things, while engineers and scientists typically aren't. So I think it's very constructive to see more of that in the research community and in technical education. Down here, and then I'll try to go back there. Hold on, she's almost here with the mic.
Thank you. With the studies that you've been doing now, especially with what you were showing with Doug earlier, have you been working at all in conjunction with paralysis or any of those issues?
Some of the research volunteers have been individuals who have suffered paralysis. The most practical outputs from that work so far have been the introduction of a prosthetic arm. I think they're just now researching how to do the neural control part of it. But the first part of just making the mechanical arm much better, that's now an FDA-approved product that's getting out to wounded warriors. But I don't know the whole story on the paralysis side. Let's go back there.
Are you really going to be able to control it? You say it's human choice, but as we've seen with so much of the internet, it's getting pirated and manipulated. So
Yeah.
that's the first question. And secondly, when you say we put our minds together literally to problem solve, are we doing that? Are there people who are working together literally to problem solve with putting their minds together?
I think that's meant to be speculative because I think we're not at that point yet. You're absolutely right that when you have a wide open environment like the internet and in a free society, it does feel like it's hard to control, and that's actually by design. My point is that it's not the technology that's making those choices. Those are choices being made by individuals. They may be individuals with malice, individuals who are pranksters, but it's not, the technology isn't doing it, right? It's simply, technology is amoral. It's really what the humans are doing. But your point is right, and those are the challenges, is how are we going to behave as a society given that? Back there in the back row.
Are there any particular technologies that you're excited about to transform the international aid or development communities? And then are there any means or methods you have already of how we share that with the broader aid community and then help them bring it to scale?
Yeah, that's not my area of expertise, but even I see the power of information technologies in the developing communities around the world. And I think that to me is an example of technology that is surging forth in different ways in different societies based on what their infrastructure is, based on what their needs are. But because the costs have plummeted to such a degree and the availability is so wide, I think that's going to continue to be a very promising area. And more generally, I would just note that, a lot of what we think about in the United States is still sort of rooted in this idea that we get to have all the marbles, and that's simply not true anymore. In fact, research and development is happening globally, which is great for the world. I mean, that's what's lifting people out of poverty and really driving economies forward. But I think it's many of these technologies that we're talking about are far less centralized, they're more democratized. The information technologies and even the biological technologies, many of them, and I think that has both good and bad implications in itself. But I think in terms of access around the world, it could be very, very constructive. Let me come right here.
So I almost don't know how to start asking this question, but your comments about the potential difficulty in distinguishing between what's biological and what's the machine partner raise a lot of questions.
Yeah.
So one question might be, is there a possibility that not just the motor intent of the brain, but the cognitive, more abstract aspects of the brain could be translated to a non-biological framework like a computer system where there could be that kind of sharing? And also the idea that Robert Jastrow, the astrophysicist and science writer, speculated about a long time ago, that the future of humanity might be to move our consciousness onto non-biological frameworks and hence permanent. So maybe you could talk a little bit about.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to your first question. Maybe. I mean, I think we're still very, very early. I find that there are the second part of your question, I find that there are two themes in the research community and the technical community. And one is about how do you make machines more like human beings, and one is about how do we use our machines and our technology to advance humans. And talk about choices. I think how you frame the way you go about your research between those two is a pretty fundamental choice at the beginning. And I'm clear about what I think. I'm not that excited. I personally can't get that excited about bringing a machine to life and having it be like a human. I vote for the humans. I like the idea that we're going to advance ourselves by using our technologies, but stay in charge. Please.
You mentioned that we have all the information and knowledge and technologies that we have to tackle some of the problems, but and it is our choice to choose to do so. And even if we find a way to insert empathy into people's minds, again, it is our choice to use it for the greater good, or versus manipulation or gain. So, and that requires some sort of education in wisdom and common sense that is inclusive of all the humanity and the planet. Is there a way to teach wisdom and common sense?
I think those things can certainly be learned. Whether they can be taught is perhaps another question. But I think you put your finger on the issue, because maybe to come back to propaganda and social media and fake news, many people, and it's been great to see so many grassroots efforts are bubbling up, and I hope that they will be successful in shining a light on fake news and countering some of these horrible messages that are out there. But at the end of the day, the only way we win is if the recipient of all that information, I like to say that they need to have an open mind, but not so open that their brain falls out. And that kind of intelligent judgment that's on the other side of the screen is how we win, and it does very much come back to an education and, yes, STEM education, but also critical thinking and understanding the world. Let's come right here.
Hi, one specific and one more general question. Specifically on the spectrum sharing technology, does that mean that like a lot of the spectrum that's been sold is going to be massively deflationary because you're going to have much more capacity in that network? So that's one specific question. The second question is, I mean, the examples you gave today were amazing. I think a number of people at Ideas have talked about self-driving cars or radiology being disrupted by AI.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you see from your seat that within the next 10 years will be ubiquitous and disruptive that wouldn't be obvious to people who aren't in your seat?
Let's see. So your first question again? Spectrum, right. Well, I mean, we can only hope that spectrum becomes so plentiful because we use it in such a powerful and effective way. But, the dream I described is something that we're very far from being able to do. You can't take off-the-shelf artificial intelligence technologies and just sort of make that happen. That's why it's a DARPA program. And we talked about how you can understand each individual system but not understand the complex interactions among them. Now imagine that when the agents are artificial intelligence learning adaptive systems, right? So I think it's going to be a while before we know that can really work. But absolutely, I think, I actually suspect that our demand for spectrum, for wireless data capacity, let me say it that way, is going to outpace any technological ability to expand the use of the spectrum. So I personally wouldn't give you any stock advice based on the spectrum challenge. Your second question was? Not obvious. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I actually think we're having some very important discussions about exactly the right topics. What is the future of work? What kinds of jobs will be destroyed? What kinds might be created? How does that match to how people are educated and how we think about our roles in society? Those are exactly the right kinds of questions. The one thing I think I find missing to some degree. I think we actually have to understand what the technology can and can't do, and I'm sure we're going to get into this in some of the AI topics that are coming up. But there's a little bit of a sense right now that AI and machine learning is like magic pixie dust, and you sprinkle it on things and the jobs go away and machines just magically do it, and that's not what's happening at all. Those technologies have advanced in some very, very powerful ways. But just as an example, I think I'll just mention one dimension of where I think clarity about the technology is important. Machine learning techniques, every week you read about a machine learning system that can do something better than humans, identify images or translate language. And what that means is that it is statistically better than humans, and humans are error prone, so that's completely plausible. But I think we need to be clear that when something is statistically better than humans, that doesn't mean that it's perfect. And the kinds of mistakes these machine systems make are the kinds of mistakes no human would ever make, right? And so if you're thinking about microtrades or image recognition for a photo application, it's fine if there are a few mistakes. They're very funny and life goes on. But if you're worrying about autonomous weapon systems in the military or self-driving cars for all of us, those are places where each decision can be a life or death decision. And knowing when and where to trust the technology becomes really, really key. So maybe that's just an example of something that I wish were a little bit more visible in the conversations. Who else? Maybe all the way in the back there.
Can you talk a little bit about the process by which the R&D that's being done at DARPA gets commercialized? I'm thinking that as I've heard you talk, it occurs to me that there's enormous opportunities here for getting intellectual property rights that can be transferred to a commercial company to bring into being, and there must be a process, but I'd like to know a little more about it.
Yeah, there are many processes across several thousand. So DARPA is an agency that is a couple of hundred government employees in an office building in Arlington. They come up with these program ideas and allocate resources to them, and then through competitive processes, the money from the agency flows to researchers of every kind. It goes to people in universities, people in small companies, people in big companies, people in commercial companies, people in defense companies, and government labs, whoever has the technical capacity and the good ideas, and that's where the research happens. And particularly for the kinds of technologies that we're talking about here today, these are examples of technologies where we won't get the national security benefit until commercialization in pursuit of non-military markets happens first. And so especially in those cases, DARPA typically will structure programs to make sure that the performer of the research owns the intellectual property and has the incentives to try to take it forward on their own nickel and commercialize it. And that historically that's happened in a whole raft of different ways, sometimes within the company that earned the DARPA award initially. Often it's work done in a university, and when the PhD students graduate, out the door they go and they start a company, and so many Silicon Valley companies can trace back to a DARPA project at Stanford or Berkeley, and the same at MIT. So all of those paths are available. DARPA doesn't control or drive that. You need that to be driven by entrepreneurs and investors and companies and markets. But what we try to do at DARPA is make sure that the research and the intellectual property is staged in such a way that, we lead horses to water, but then after that the market has to drive. Please, right here.
Hi. Building on the question about the link to humanitarian aid, I actually run an R&D lab at the International Rescue Committee. One of the things that we were inspired by was learning from the community of treating veterans with PTSD, is the idea of the growth mindset, and how could we bring that to refugees recovering from trauma. Could you talk a little bit about whether or not you see any breakthroughs happening in terms of the research of treating people suffering from trauma?
The only perspective I have on that is from DARPA's work on neurotechnology. And much of that is focused on some of the most extreme cases of PTSD or traumatic brain injury. But I think as we're doing the research on what's happening with neural signals across brain regions, or with understanding how memory is formed and recalled, I think in that work, which initially I think its therapeutic benefit will only be for those who are suffering so much that brain surgery is actually a good alternative. And yet doing that research, I think, is giving us some insights that perhaps could be useful to a broader community. Who have I missed? I'm sorry I can't see everybody. Okay.
Are they doing any major work with paralysis? Because over 25 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, Dr. Petrowski came up with electrodes that you could attach to the legs and make people stand up and walk.
Yep.
And nothing has ever been done with any of that technology. Today on an airplane, you can push a button and the leg rest raises in front of you to lift your legs up. None of these things have been applied to paralysis. I'm wondering why the delay?
I don't know the answer to that question, but let me speculate. One part of the problem is moving the limb in question. The other is tying to neural signaling. And there, our understanding of what those signals from the motor cortex or sensory cortex are doing, what the intent of the brain is, that is very brand new work. And much of it started with implants that require surgery to implant electrodes on the surface of the brain. And so I think as it moves to the peripheral nervous system and as these capabilities become more robust, perhaps there will be some possibility to move forward for paralysis.
Electrodes just attached to the leg will make the knee joint go straight, and that doesn't take anything. They already have done that, but they've never done anything with it.
I'm sorry, I don't know why no one's pursuing that. Thank you very much, all. Have a good day.